Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. In today's episode, I speak to Neil Kelly, founder of Vector Partners, about talent transformation in pharma. Neil has considerable experience in talent acquisition within life sciences, including leading the function during a high-growth period at Thermo Fisher and Patheon. We discuss some of the challenges and complexities of the pharma industry, the trends which will be shaping the year ahead, and what that means to organisational design. Neil shares lots of insights and advice for how pharma and biotech leaders can recruit and retain high-performing global teams. Neil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me on the show.
By way of introduction, I think it'd be great if you could just talk about your experience in talent acquisition in pharma and biotech and what led to you founding Vector in the first place.
So my journey within the pharma industry has been over 20 years of my career. So I've kind of dipped in and out of pharmaceuticals, biologics, biotech industry for many years. And I've always had a passion around all things new. So, of course, science is a great place to learn those things new, through university, through working with some great colleagues over the years. So I really started my career within talent acquisition within pharmaceuticals with Thermo Fisher and Patheon. So Patheon was acquired in 2017 by Thermo Fisher. I was one of the global talent acquisition leaders of that business, moved over to Thermo Fisher, and spent a great 5 years growing that business from what we started at, which was about 7,000 people. And where I left was over 100,000 people, so 100,000 employees. So it was a massive change over that 5 year period, but a great one. And we went through, of course, the pandemic. So we were really front and center of growing the fight against COVID and creating millions of vaccines for people across the globe. So that was a fascinating period of growth because we needed the people, and we had to hire the people fast to service that demand. So bringing it up to today, I now run a company for the last 2 years called Vector Partners. We specialize within the CDMO and CRO space of the pharma industry. And we build, we assess, we build, we recruit and develop leadership teams around the world. And it's been a great 2 years of growth. We continue to see great growth in Asia and US right now. So I look forward to sharing some of those experiences with the listeners.
Thank you. And so sitting where you are, I mean, I think you've got a great cross-sectional view of what's happening in the industry, what some of the trends are around the types of employee and talent management initiatives which are happening at the moment in pharma. Yeah. What have you been noticing, particularly since the pandemic? What are those trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so what we saw in the pandemic was a regression from the workplace, so physical workplace, of course, and which has been written and spoken, a lot about over the last 3 years. But, it becomes a real challenge for HR functions and talent functions of how to manage that, because you have this, dichotomy around, you've got certain roles that you simply can't have remote. Whether that's manufacturing or supply chain, physically getting the product to the customer, whereas there is a whole bunch of roles that can go remote. So therefore, you've got this tension, this challenge within the workforce itself. So I think that's one thing that companies are still trying to get their arms around. The other factors are that we, from a supply chain perspective, the supply chain is becoming more and more global. So at one point, we're trying to localize it, regionalize it, but the ability to source product from anywhere in the world is just a reality now. And as you think around talent in your workforce globally, then you start suddenly realizing that actually it's not so much about where the product is, where the work is being done, but it's where you can source that talent. Because there's certain talent around the world that is really short, and certainly in some of those major conurbations, whether that's, technology talent is, although there is certain layoffs recently, it's still a major shortage of certain talent. So you start to look at your landscape globally of where can you source talent versus where you need to produce the product.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing that within roles such as procurement, sourcing, business partnering? Do you think that those are roles which can go more global than they are currently?
They are, because we do business globally now. You and I sit a few hundred miles away, but it's as if we're next to each other, right? So it's the same with everyone else now in business. I mean, we don't think about the distance as a limitation to trade or to do business together. I was talking to a chief executive a few days ago, and he was saying during the pandemic they closed a load of deals remote. So they never met each other. And that was completely different than 5 years ago, where you must get on a plane, you must go and see somebody. So, obviously the major benefit is the environmental, impact. But more importantly, it's the speed. So we can get deals closed faster. We don't require to have that face-to-face contact as we used to before. And therefore, yeah, I mean, procurement roles, sourcing roles are possible. But again, you have to separate those things out where you require a human who's physically on a site versus somebody who can deliver those activities remotely. So that is featuring in workforce planning of what roles can be remote versus on-site or in person.
Something that we hear a lot about is that there's a real talent gap in those types of roles, or a real shortage of people who've got the right skills to be able to walk into a role like that. What strategies and best practices could you share around better ways of finding that sort of talent, and when you've got them, how to make sure you keep those kind of roles?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? Because just to answer the last part first, some of the factors that the listeners may not be aware of is that, the example I use regularly is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you think about those needs around, providing shelter to your family, to provide a better standard of living, to put food on the table. So there's some factors in some roles across the world right now, and some talent are making decisions based on human needs, right? So I need to make more money. I need to achieve a better standard of living. I need to put this food on the table, right? So they're moving in some cases for an extra $1,000, $2,000 per year, or a couple of dollars per hour, and that's the reality. That's the reality of some of the decisions that are being made. And therefore, if you then go back to how that talent life cycle is being managed, then you're seeing a faster turnover of talent. There is more roles in the market than there ever have been before. So there's new roles that have been created that weren't around 5 years ago, and that's been driven by digital innovation mostly. But then secondly, then you've got the talent who have are looking to make the move because of those demands, those changes in the market that are happening. Those opportunities that have been created weren't around 5 years ago.
Something which we talk about a lot is how people sort of fall into it, and that there isn't that sort of structured leaving university. You don't really think about that these types of roles even exist, and you get people going into partnering and business development roles who may have a background in immunology or science. And also from the other side, people who come from more of a pure procurement role, who sort of come into life sciences and have to upskill themselves. That feels to me like it's not the ideal situation. And I wonder what your views are on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've during the time at Thermo Fisher and before, when I was in global talent acquisition and talent management roles, one of the challenges is trying to recruit talent in a market that is short on talent, short on the skills that you require. And companies talk a lot about skills development and skills hiring, but the reality is that the skills are not there in some cases. So you then start asking the question of why is that, right? And I do a lot of work at the University of Bath and beyond. And we've really pushed this narrative around, having the skills for the future, because the education that is being pushed out from universities at the moment is actually out of date compared to what the industry needs. So if you look at, supply chain sourcing, I mean, there's very few dedicated sourcing, procurement, supply chain courses out there. And if they are, it's dated in terms of some of the content that's being given to students and delivered to students. So I think where we've had to go in the past is look at strengths. So what are the strengths of those individuals? So you talk about coming from the right science background. Do they understand the science that the organization is trying to deliver? And I think where you go into is, can you take a scientist and make them into a procurement person, or, can you take a scientist and put them in supply chain? And the answer is yes. But if they've got the right strengths to do that, so do they have the right behaviors? Do they have the right strengths in terms of, communication, leadership, etc.? Do they have the right core behaviors to drive within that culture? Can they develop that culture? So we've gone a lot deeper in terms of solving the question of, okay, that particular talent doesn't exist in the market. So, we've tried to bypass, what the label of the degree says on their resume or their CV, and really start to look at who they are as an individual and their behaviors.
What responsibility would you say the organization itself has around training if you're not able to recruit in someone who's a fully formed member who's got all of those skills? I guess I'm interested in finding out which you would say is easier to train in. Is it easier to get someone with a background in external manufacturing or partnering and train them on the science, or vice versa?
It's difficult to train them on the science. It is, particularly. So if you think about again, this may change in the future, but current state now, generally you've got scientists facing off in scientists in most parts. So there's a high level within the pharma industry anyway, from the top down. So most CEOs have a science background, most CEOs generally. And then if you then cascade down all the way through procurement and supply chain, there is a high degree of knowledge around science throughout the business. I would say that there is a number of areas that are transferable. Supply chain is one of them. So HR is another one, finance is another one. So those, what I call enabling functions, are the areas that have transferable skills. So, and actually we tended to look for those skills outside of the pharma industry. So what do we look for in supply chain? We look for agility, we look for speed, we look for sharpness around commerciality. That generally has not come from the pharma industry. I hate to say, we go and source that talent from those industries that are really lean. So, for example, the appliance manufacturing, the telecoms industry, even 3PL, so third-party logistics. So these industries have really sharpened their pencil around some of these skills. So we can go into some of these industries and pluck out the very best. The benefit is as well that actually the compensation is generally lower within these other industries as well. So you're able to attract with, the pharma industry pays roughly about 75th percentile of the market, whereas the logistics, the supply chain industry pays about 50% of the market. So again, so if you've got a commercial advantage or a compensation advantage of attracting someone.
What blind spots would you say that life science leadership sometimes has, often as a consequence of coming from that science, let's say left brain state of mind? What impact has that had on organizations?
The reality of an average pharmaceutical business out there is that the CEO is either coming from a scientific or engineering background. And the challenge with that is that they, from a profile, a leadership profile, and an employee profile, that they've often worked in silo, right? So it's either in a small team or on their own, whether that's a PhD background or working on specific projects. So there is a certain behavior that then cascades into an organization. And it's not always a behavior that you want in your organization. So in order to make create a diverse business, of course, you need a diverse set of skills and
Mm.
behaviors. So I think that's probably the one thing I've seen as the biggest blind spot, but also the biggest opportunity for pharma businesses to grab hold of and to recognize. I think some organizations out there, and there are some really great ones who have made major impact in this area. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of creating that, that diverse culture, which is required for a global way of working.
I wonder if you could share any kind of examples that you've got of how that manifests itself. What problems does that create?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it creates toxic cultures
Mm.
ultimately. So if you're a business that is driven by a demand and control environment, which some organizations are, unfortunately, then it creates that demand and control. So from the top down, we will tell you what to do.
Mm.
Okay. And therefore, there is a time and a place, right? Because there, particularly in times of crisis, you have to move fast. You have to be told. You need to know what you're doing and when you're doing it. And the pandemic was a great example of that. From the government down across the world, they said, this is what's happening. This is what we
Mm.
require of you. Very specific. Okay, time and place. But that doesn't create a great company culture long term, though. So you need to, it stifles innovation within an
Mhm.
organization. And therefore, when you stifle innovation, you stifle your product development, you stifle, that freedom of thought, and therefore the average employee, then it impacts them. They don't feel they have a voice anymore. So it impacts actually a number of levels within your organization negatively
Mm.
if you let that manifest into something which, as I say, which is toxic.
So, with that in mind, then, what advice would you have for leaders of, particularly on the commercial side? So, if you're looking to
Mm.
build a high performing function, what kind of best practices would you have for how to design against that and how to make it a high performing team?
It starts with the basics, honestly, Luke. I mean, it does. So if you've ever been in a sales meeting or or a leadership team meeting, and how often do you hear only two or three voices around the table?
Mm.
You know, we've all been there, right? We had those leaders who are shouting, bawling, in some cases crying, unfortunately, but the voices are loud, right? And it's to create an inclusive environment. Listen to those people around the room, bring those voices into those discussions. Now, that's obviously clearly within a meeting setting, but I think it's a great example of those small voices and those little, those individuals who feel that they're being belittled within that environment. We really need to look at their raising their voice, allow them a platform to speak, because honestly, they say some great things. They might not say it very often, but when they talk, it really makes sense and people listen.
Mm.
So as you think for that philosophy in mind, scale that back to your organizational design, scale that back to the skills that you're bringing in. Are you creating a diverse structure within your organizational design? Do you have a diverse set of skills when you're designing the profiles, success profiles that sit within your business? Are you positioning them in the right way in terms of mentoring and coaching? So that, and the list goes on and on. But
Mm.
with that principle of listen to other people, allow them a voice, allow them a platform, I don't think you'll go far wrong.
And how do you do that at Vector Partners? When you take a brief, how do you
Yeah.
bake diversity and inclusivity into the type of candidates you're putting forwards?
Yeah, I mean, we always start with challenging the company of what they really need.
Mm.
So, giving that evidence-based approach of, as we're designing the success profile and the profile of individual, we give them a reality check. So we do our homework, we do our research, we understand our market already. So, I made a point, earlier around where the talent sits. So we've got a very clear idea of, can you hire that talent? Is it diverse talent? What's the likelihood of success? So we start to stack the this, the stakes in the company's favor by making sure we start making decisions before we've even spoken to anyone. So that data insights, market intelligence, really important within the work we do. When it comes to the assessing against the leadership team as it is, so that's part of our work as well. We will also give, kind of predetermine what skills the company has already. And therefore we can start to make advice. Okay, well, you've got certain skills already. There's a certain voices around the table that, and very often, a lot of the companies are still male dominant on the leadership teams, even though we've made massive strides over recent years. So of course we'll call that out, which is more obvious, and we'll also call out the requirement to have if you're an international business but you're US or UK or French dominant, then of course that's going to be a disadvantage to be an inclusive leadership team and diverse leadership team. So we start to really put the mirror in front of organizations to allow them start to think about, okay, well, these are the benefits of creating a more diverse leadership team. So when we get that opportunity to hire a new leader into that team or that management team, then we really carefully understand, okay, how do they fit in? How can we set them up for success? What does their onboarding look like, even before we've recruited anyone? Because we then map that out. We allow the candidates and the talent to understand this company's taking your hire and your development very seriously. This is what your first 100 days is going to look like. This is what your development plan will look like as well. So of course we can't answer, all questions from day one, but we can at least set them up for success. And then the work we do after that is very much around leadership development. So we work with leadership teams to develop them and their teams to say, okay, well, where are we? We always link it back to business objectives, business results, and where are we tracking towards that 1, 2, 3, 5-year plan? What's the skills required? How do we then upskill them? Whether that's through external sources, business schools, universities, etc., partnering with these organizations. So it's really what we like to call a 180 approach between the assessment, the recruitment, and the development.
When it comes to pharma, and I don't know whether this is a victim of its own success, really, in the speed that organizations have been growing over the last few years, there's a real lack of standardization, I think, between the way that these companies fit together, the way that departments fit together, the way that job titles and job roles have been structured, what one job role means. I think a good example of that for me is around roles like business development, and that can be whether you can be business development in the big pharma company and then you're sourcing, but then equally if you're CDMO and you're actually looking to sell to the same business development job titles. I wonder what your views are on that, and if there is a lack of standardization, what types of problems that causes for organizational design.
Again, at a basic level, when you design an organization, you try to use titles and language that is common across industries, because it's easy to hire, a business development manager in one business versus a business development manager in another. But I think what you're alluding to, I think it's absolutely spot on, is that some organizations are now calling them, new business, account management, success coaches, success, managers. The list goes on and on. So the kind of the jobs taxonomy across the industry is so both diverse, but also now confusing, because you haven't got any alignment or a point of reference to say, okay, business development in one business is not the same as business development in another. And I think that's the challenge. So as you go out into the market, you don't have a common language. So that's of course an issue. It's what the flip side to that is that you're creating innovation. You're trying to do something different. But it does create confusion both outside and inside the business. So I think at a basic level, you've got recruitment issues. I think another level is when you start to look at compensation levels. The skills required and the competence required to do certain roles is very important, because as you globalize your business, you need to determine the levels between, director, manager, individual contributor. And therefore the compensation structures then get impacted as well. So if VP of sales and marketing suddenly says, okay, I want to change the taxonomy of my team and the words I use to describe what they're doing, great. But how does that impact everything else, right? From is that now a role that is facing off into the customer? Do they have more reports? Do they have less reports? Does that impact compensation? If it's now remote, if they're based in Ohio versus Massachusetts, how does that impact compensation structures? So this basic question of, can we change job titles, scope of activities might be an easy one for somebody to answer, but the ramifications of that are huge in a business. And that's why when you hear about companies going through an organizational redesign, and people think, well, it's just a change which we're making. And it's a relatively easy. Why does HR take so long? I mean, the ripple effect is huge. And then it goes into tax issues and the list goes on and on. So
are there any particular signals you're getting from the market as to trends which are going to be likely important for 2024? So whether that would be around digital transformation or sustainability or whatever it is. I mean, from the type of roles which you're currently recruiting for, does that give you any signals as to what the industry is prioritizing at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one thing we talk about a lot about recently is doing more with less. So this concept we're doing more with less, and it's across every industry, in fact. But the reality is that we've implemented, as businesses, organizations, we've spent a lot on technology over the last few years. I don't think the adoption rates and the effectiveness of that technology is as high as they expected. So if you spoke to a CEO, they said, yeah, great, we've seen some efficiency improvements, but not really the big returns of investment. So I think that's one element. The second, as you mentioned before, skills development. I think skills development will continue to be paramount for organizations moving forward, certainly for the next 2 to 3 years minimum. And why? Because it's not only a great retention tool, but the second is that it also allows you to create more skills within your existing resources. So if you take an example, an average procurement function or supply chain function, very often they will have a defined set of skills and a defined boundaries in terms of where they operate. But imagine you've got more all-rounders in your business. So those people who've got more skills are able to do more, create a higher output for you as a business. That's got to be a good thing, right? It's a good thing for the employee, good thing for the business. Now, where the risk factor is when you start to, as an organization, you start to put too much on that individual or require too much. So you're suddenly going from 110% to 150%. That's not acceptable. That leads fast to burnout. And therefore there's, the health aspects you start to consider. So I think that they're really some of the factors that we would see within the industry right now. Beyond the rhetoric we've already heard around the technology which will continue to drive the industry forward. Moving from a mechanical to a digital environment has been happening for a long time, so that hasn't changed. I think we'll be shifting from a digital to an AI enabled environment very fast, but we're not quite there yet.
I'd like to wrap up by mentioning Talent Sandbox as well. So that's something which I know you've launched in the last, when was it you launched? In the last sort of 12 months or so, I believe?
Yeah, 6 months ago, yeah. So it's been a great journey. Online learning platform for specifically the talent acquisition industry, which will be, it's training for in-house recruitment teams and also hiring managers. So we really bring that. You mentioned the word standardization a few moments ago, which is absolutely the language we use. So having standard ways of working really improves the effectiveness of every parts of the hiring process. So yeah, it's been a great project so far. We are now at around about 9 months of learning activity, soon to be 12 months. And we've had a number of big pharma companies who have signed up with us, who are looking to really lift the bar and create a better recruiting experience. So yeah.
Very exciting. Thank you so much for your time. Really fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Luke. I look forward to continuing these discussions with you.
A lot of useful insights there. To find out more about the two businesses Neil mentioned, you can go to vectorpartnersta.com for talent acquisition services and consultants, and check out talentsandbox.com for online resources to train your own talent teams. Thanks to Neil, and thank you for listening.